communities, small scattered patches of sand and rock rising out of the ocean. To the west, there is nothing except America. The inhabitants scrape a frugal living from the sea and the sand and the low-lying hills and peat bogs. The little island of Toddy is a completely isolated community. It's 100 miles from the mainland, 100 miles from the nearest cinema or dance hall. But the islanders certainly know a thing or two about celebration and having fun and how to enjoy themselves, because truly they had all that they needed.
O brachenlam, tanelam, brachenlam, suwen, brachenlam, tanelam, brachenlam, suwen, brachenlam, tanelam, brachenlam, suwen, brachenlam, shetanelam, shebrachenlam, suwen. Brachen tana 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 brachenlam suwen, brachen tana 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 brachenlam suwen, brachen tana 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 brachenlam suwen, brachenlam shetanelam shebrachenlam suwen.
Well, they had everything they needed, and they really did know how to enjoy themselves. But then, in 1943, disaster overwhelmed this little island. No, it wasn't famine or pestilence. It was something far more sinister. It wasn't Hitler's bombs or the hordes of an invading army, but something far, far worse. There was no whiskey. Whiskey, Escabal. In Gaelic they call it the water of life. And to a true islander, life without whiskey is almost not worth living. From that day, every man went into mourning. Mourning for a departed spirit. It was truly a sad time, and a gloom descended over the little island, not unlike a fog. But then, speaking of fog, on a foggy day, the cargo ship SS Cabinet Minister ran aground on the rocks. A shipwreck was not unusual in these parts, but for islanders struggling to get by on wartime rations, the cargo was astonishing. It included 250,000 bottles of whiskey. So under the cover of darkness, the locals rowed out to the wreck and scrambled over the side using rope ladders. They filled up their rowboats with as many cases of whiskey that their boats could hold. That night, they were back to celebrating, and they had what's called a ceilidh. There was much drinking, singing, and dancing.
Brachenlam suwen, brachenlam tanelam, brachenlam suwen, brachenlam tanelam, brachenlam suwen, brachenlam shetanelam, shebrachenlam suwen, brachen tana 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 brachenlam suwen, brachen tana 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 brachenlam suwen, brachen tana 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 brachenlam suwen, brachenlam shetanelam, shebrachenlam suwen.
The next morning, the sun seemed to shine more brightly. The sky seemed bluer, the grass greener, and the sheep were even whiter. The little island of Toddy was hardly recognizable. But there was trouble ahead, because no duty had been paid on the whiskey. Customs and excise officers came after the islanders. They were determined to confiscate the whiskey. Luckily, the islanders were tipped off that the authorities were on their way, and they began hiding the whiskey. They hid the whiskey all over the island as well as in their homes. They found some pretty clever hiding places. They hid the whiskey by putting bottles in their milk churns. They filled up hot water bottles with whiskey. They hid bottles under the covers and cradles. And they finally found a good use for a fiddle case. No, it says here they put bottles in the fiddle cases. They buried bottles in the crofts and put their wheelbarrows covered in peat over the top. Alas, the authorities were crushed because they were not able to find even one bottle of whiskey. They returned home very embarrassed. They knew they'd been outwitted by those crafty islanders. And the islanders, for their part, returned to their ceilidh and lived happily ever after.